Freedom is not man's default state. It's a fantasy he worships but rarely survives, because to be truly free is to bear the unbearable weight of responsibility, and most people, when faced with that burden, kneel. Machiavelli understood this with surgical clarity. He saw that men crave safety more than sovereignty, certainty more than chaos, structure more than truth, and so they serve, not because they are forced to, but because obedience feels like relief. The human mind, left ungoverned, fears its own vastness. Freedom is a wilderness. It demands navigation, choice, accountability, and the average man does not want to choose. He wants to be told. He doesn't want to bear the risk of error. He wants the comfort of instruction. So when the ruler arrives in the form of law, religion, employer, or ideology, he kneels willingly. He finds peace in servitude because it frees him from himself. This is the first law of obedience. People serve not because they are weak, but because they are tired. Tired of uncertainty, tired of decision, tired of being responsible for their own chaos. The powerful Machiavelli wrote, "Understand this exhaustion. They design order, not to liberate but to contain. They offer direction, identity, and meaning. They know that the man who believes he is guided will never realize he is controlled." Look closely at history. Every empire begins with a promise, protection, prosperity, belonging. And every empire endures because the people find safety in its chains. The chains are invisible but comforting, woven from routine, entertainment, and moral approval. So long as obedience feels righteous, no one calls it slavery. This is why Machiavelli never glorified rebellion. He understood that rebellion is temporary, servitude is eternal. For every revolution that destroys a tyrant, 1,000 new rulers emerge from the ruins, each offering the same promise. This time obedience will feel like freedom. The masses believe them. Because servitude is not imposed, it's inherited. We are trained for it from birth. The classroom teaches compliance before curiosity. The workplace rewards silence before innovation. Religion praises submission before understanding. And so by the time we reach adulthood, obedience feels like virtue. That's why those who question power are labeled dangerous, because to question is to disturb the illusion of safety. And nothing terrifies the obedient more than the idea that they are not victims, but volunteers. The psychology of servitude is not built on fear alone, it's built on belonging. To serve is to belong to something larger than the self, and belonging offers a form of immortality. When you obey the system, you become part of its continuity. When you question it, you risk isolation, the exile that freedom demands. That's why most people prefer to kneel inside a crowd than stand alone in clarity. Freedom feels like loneliness. Obedience feels like family. And the rulers of the world understand this perfectly. They design narratives that make obedience moral. Work becomes purpose. Debt becomes participation. Conformity becomes compassion. Every system gives you a story to sanctify your submission. Machiavelli called this the illusion of virtue. He knew that rulers must never tell people they are slaves. They must convince them they are citizens of order. Once you give people a moral reason to obey, you don't need walls. Their conscience becomes the cage. The average man doesn't want freedom. He wants permission. Permission to live safely within the parameters of acceptance. Permission to feel good while doing what he's told. And permission is the currency of every ruler. That's why the powerful rarely use force. Force is crude, costly, and visible. Obedience, on the other hand, is cheap and invisible, a product willingly consumed by the mind. To rule without resistance, one must learn to create meaning, because meaning is the leash people build for themselves. They'll die defending it, even if it binds them. That's the secret Machiavelli never softened. You don't need to enslave a man who believes his servitude is sacred, and yet, within every obedient mind, a quiet voice remains. It whispers that something feels off, that safety has begun to taste like stagnation, that the very order they trust might be the prison they fear, but few ever listen. The whisper is drowned by the noise of belonging, the applause of the herd. The herd rewards predictability. It celebrates conformity, and it punishes solitude. To think too deeply is to betray the tribe. To question too loudly is to become dangerous. So people learn to hide their doubts behind politeness, their individuality behind progress, their awareness behind performance. And in that theater of obedience, each man becomes both servant and spectator, applauding his own captivity. Machiavelli saw this not as tragedy, but as truth. He didn't despise the obedient, he designed for them. He knew that the world cannot function if everyone seeks freedom, because freedom is chaos, and chaos cannot be governed. So the few who rule by understanding the many who serve. They do not force the world to obey, they simply give it reasons to want to. That is the nature of servitude, not an accident, not a failure, but a preference. Obedience is not chaos contained, it's chaos engineered. It doesn't happen by accident. It's a design, a silent, intricate mechanism that turns free will into functionality, individuality into utility. And once you see how it works, the world no longer looks like progress, it looks like programming. Machiavelli understood this centuries before psychology gave it language. He wrote that a ruler should never rely on violence when people can be taught to love their servitude. Fear can control for a season, but belief controls forever. Every system from monarchy to democracy runs on this same algorithm. Convince the masses that obedience is moral and they'll police themselves. The perfect government is not one that enforces laws. It's one that makes enforcement unnecessary, because when people internalize authority, the ruler becomes invisible. Look closely, and you'll see the machinery everywhere, quiet, elegant, efficient. In the education system that rewards memorization over curiosity, in the corporate world that praises loyalty over intelligence, in religion that confuses humility with surrender, in entertainment that sells rebellion as spectacle, so real rebellion feels redundant. Each part of the system trains the mind to mistake conformity for safety. The goal isn't to silence you, it's to make you volunteer your silence. The machinery doesn't need walls or guards. It has algorithms and routines. It doesn't need to threaten you with punishment. It distracts you with comfort. That's why obedience in the modern world doesn't feel like control. It feels like participation. The system asks for your opinion, your engagement, your vote, your feedback. It flatters your ego while mapping your behavior. And every gesture of freedom you make inside it becomes another data point of obedience. Machiavelli would call this the economy of perception. He knew that to rule effectively, one must allow people to perform autonomy. Because the illusion of freedom pacifies revolt better than oppression ever could. When a man believes his choices are his own, he will defend the system that limits them. The machinery runs on repetition. It turns obedience into rhythm, daily rituals that keep the mind subdued. Wake, work, consume, sleep, repeat. The repetition creates security. Security creates trust. And trust blinds the mind. This is why the most dangerous rulers don't destroy choice. They flood you with it. Because an abundance of meaningless options hides the absence of real freedom. It's easier to control people when they're busy, choosing between identical cages. Machiavelli warned that a wise prince should let the people feel they have power, not actual power, symbolic power. Power to complain, to participate, to express anger safely within permitted boundaries. Because once outrage is allowed, it becomes a release valve, not a revolution. The modern machinery of obedience perfects this strategy. It manufactures outrage, feeds division, and ensures the people exhaust themselves fighting shadows. You scroll, argue, react, but every action reinforces the same architecture. The machine doesn't care what side you're on. It only cares that you keep playing. The secret to endless obedience is endless motion. A distracted mind doesn't question its direction, and a divided population doesn't notice the hand guiding both sides. You can see it in politics, the eternal duel between red and blue, left and right. The faces change, the slogans shift, but the structure remains untouched. Because the true ruler is not the man elected, it's the machinery itself. It feeds on loyalty, consumes attention, and grows stronger through participation. That's why those who step outside of it are called dangerous or worse, irrelevant. The system cannot comprehend silence. It depends on noise, constant movement, constant expression. To stop reacting is to disappear from its map, and to disappear is to reclaim something priceless, unpredictability. But unpredictability terrifies the obedient. They've been trained to see stability as virtue. They confuse stillness with stagnation and predictability with peace. So they return willingly to their roles, to the comfort of being known, categorized, and managed. Their servitude doesn't feel like loss. It feels like purpose. That's the brilliance of the machinery. It doesn't enslave the body. It enslaves meaning itself. Every word and success, virtue, love, justice is rewritten to fit its architecture. And once the language is owned, the mind follows. Machiavelli once said, "The wise ruler never removes religion. He replaces Tosin. In our time, that religion is productivity, efficiency, visibility. You are told to produce, optimize, perform, not because it leads to truth, but because it keeps you useful. The modern subject is not a prisoner, he's an asset. He's not chained by walls, he's bound by metrics. And as long as he believes those metrics measure worth, he'll never question who built them. The machinery of obedience doesn't demand loyalty to a person, only to process. You serve systems, not kings, algorithms, not gods. You obey because the structure feels rational, not tyrannical. And the best tyranny is the one that looks like logic. Machiavelli foresaw this evolution. When the ruler's face disappears, his control becomes eternal. Because you can't overthrow what you can't name. That is the quiet perfection of obedience, a world that no longer needs tyrants because the people have learned to manage themselves. The most effective form of control isn't fear, it's comfort. Fear makes people run. Comfort makes them stay. And Machiavelli understood, if you give a man peace without purpose, he'll defend his cage as if it were a kingdom. The powerful have always known this secret. Pain awakens rebellion, but comfort sedates it. You don't need to silence the masses when you can lull them into satisfaction. The modern world doesn't enslave through cruelty, it enslaves through convenience. It doesn't demand your obedience with force, it seduces you with options. Streaming, scrolling, buying, belonging. Each small pleasure becomes a thread, and together, those threads weave the softest prison humanity has ever known. People call it stability, routine, normal life. But beneath the calm rhythm of productivity lies a quiet paralysis, the soul too entertained to evolve. The system doesn't need to hide its chains anymore. It simply makes them comfortable enough that no one wants to remove them. That's the second law of obedience. If you make slavery feel like safety, no one will resist it. Look around. The world calls it balance, work-life harmony, financial security. But what does it really mean? It means the average person spends their entire life maintaining a structure built to exhaust them just enough to stay docile, but never enough to rebel. The machine has mastered the dosage. A weekend here, a raise there, a new device, a dopamine hit. These are the rewards for staying loyal to the rhythm. And those who disrupt the rhythm, the outliers, the dreamers, the thinkers, are labeled unstable, unrealistic, ungrateful. Because the obedient majority must believe that stillness is failure, that silence is dangerous, and so they keep moving, buying, reacting, all in the name of living. Machiavelli warned that the ruler must never remove all hope from the people, not because he loved them, but because hope is the perfect leash. Give them just enough belief that things will get better and they'll endure anything. That's why comfort always comes with a promise. The next job, the next raise, the next vacation, the next product. It's never fulfillment, only the suggestion of it. And that suggestion keeps the engine of obedience alive. The tragedy isn't that people are deceived, it's that they prefer to be. Because illusion, when repeated long enough, feels like truth. And truth, when confronted without preparation, feels like pain. Freedom, real freedom, isn't a lifestyle, it's a psychological rebellion. It demands awareness, restraint, and discipline, and that's precisely what comfort erodes. The comfortable mind grows soft. It stops questioning. It stops resisting. It stops seeing. Machiavelli observed that men rise from humble beginnings through struggle, and decline from greatness through indulgence. Every empire dies the same way, not from war but from luxury, not from revolt but from apathy, and so it is with individuals. When struggle ends, reflection begins, and most can't bear reflection. They replace meaning with pleasure, purpose with productivity, and awareness with entertainment. The system doesn't need to suppress thought. It floods you with stimulation until you forget how to think. It keeps you busy enough to avoid boredom, but bored enough to crave more distraction. The wheel spins, and you call it progress. Comfort is the most sophisticated weapon ever created, because it convinces you that peace and paralysis are the same thing, and those who rule understand. The moment you stop desiring change, you become harmless. That's why the modern world rewards happiness above all else. But happiness as it's sold is not liberation. It's sedation. It's the feeling of alignment with systems designed to use you. You're not escaping the machinery. You're operating it more efficiently. The comfortable man believes he is free because he doesn't feel pain. But freedom was never about feeling good. It was about being awake, and awakening hurts. The rulers of today are not kings or generals. They are architects of comfort, engineers of dopamine, designers of distraction. Their palaces are digital. Their armies are invisible. Their weapons are notifications and trends. They don't need to conquer land. They conquer attention. Every comfort is a transaction. Every pleasure, a form of control. Each small delight you accept blindly, each convenience that saves you time, saves it for them. The more effortless your life becomes, the less of it you truly own. And yet Machiavelli wouldn't call this evil. He would call it natural. Because the masses don't want freedom. They want peace without price. They want order without risk. They want pleasure without awareness. And the few who understand that rule the many who don't. The comfort of chains is the modern throne. It doesn't bind your wrists. It wraps around your desires. It doesn't demand obedience. It invites it. And it wins because it doesn't look like domination. It looks like happiness. No ruler can control a man's mind by force, but the man himself can, and usually does, do it willingly. That's the final genius of obedience. It doesn't live in systems or laws. It lives in psychology. Machiavelli understood that a ruler's greatest ally is not fear, it's human nature. Because people are not taught to submit, they are designed to, and the design is flawless. Every person carries an ancient instinct, the need to belong, to be accepted, to be seen as good. And this instinct, though noble in appearance, becomes the foundation of servitude. It begins in childhood. The moment a child learns that approval brings reward and disobedience brings pain, a pattern forms. To survive you must please. To please you must obey. The architecture of obedience is emotional before it is rational. It's not built in palaces. It's built in the nervous system. That's why the ruler rarely needs to threaten the body. He only needs to manipulate emotion, because emotion is the leash we willingly wear. Fear of rejection, fear of exclusion, fear of judgment. These are the invisible walls that contain more people than any prison ever could. The obedient don't. Call it fear, of course. They call it kindness, humility, cooperation, morality. But strip away the moral language and what remains is calculation. Obedience is the strategy of those who've learned that safety requires surrender. Machiavelli observed that men judge more by the eye than by the hand. They care more about appearances than truth. And so the psychology of submission is built not around control, but presentation. The obedient learn to look harmless, to appear agreeable, to radiate compliance as protection. That's why most people's morality is performance, not conviction. They do what is praised, not what is right. They seek the warmth of collective approval, not the solitude of truth, because solitude feels like exile, and the obedient would rather live in lies than die in isolation. This is what makes obedience so powerful. It feels moral. It feels good. It feels safe. And once goodness becomes obedience, tyranny no longer needs violence. It hides inside virtue. The powerful have always used this flaw. They define what is moral, then let the people enforce it upon themselves. They teach the masses to shame anyone who questions the moral code, and in doing so, they turn citizens into guards. That's how modern control sustains itself. Not through kings and soldiers, but through the psychology of social policing. You don't need to burn heretics when society will cancel them for you. You don't need to silence dissent when the fearful self-censor to survive. This is not governance. It's engineering. Machiavelli wrote that a wise ruler must seem compassionate, faithful, humane, religious, and upright, but be prepared to act otherwise. He didn't just mean the prince should be deceptive. He meant the people need to believe in their own goodness, because morality, when weaponized, makes obedience eternal. A man who obeys out of fear will eventually rebel. But a man who obeys out of righteousness will never see his own chains. That's the psychology of submission, to trap the mind not with force, but with self-image. Every person builds a moral mirror, a reflection of who they think they are. And that mirror becomes sacred. You can imprison someone's body and they'll fight you, but imprison their self-concept, convince them their virtue depends on obedience, and they'll protect their captor as if defending their soul. The modern world has perfected this. You're told to be a good employee, a good citizen, a good parent, a good follower. And in that pursuit of goodness, you stop asking the only question that matters: good by whose definition? The answer is always the same: good by design. The system defines virtue in the language of compliance. To be efficient is to be good. To be agreeable is to be good. To obey is to be moral. And those who question that framework are labeled selfish, lazy, dangerous. But the deeper truth is darker. The desire to be good is the deepest form of fear, because it reveals how much you need validation to exist. That's why the powerful don't need to punish rebellion. They only need to make it unpopular. Fear of social rejection is more effective than fear of death. People will die to be accepted. They'll sacrifice truth for belonging. They'll worship systems that degrade them if it means they're not alone. Machiavelli saw this centuries ago. He knew that humanity's weakness was not evil, it was sentiment. Our empathy, our need for connection, our longing for love. These are the tools by which we enslave ourselves. The psychology of submission is built on the illusion of virtue, but beneath it lies a single truth. People will always choose emotional safety over moral clarity, and the few who don't, the ones who would rather stand alone in truth than kneel among the deceived, become something else entirely. Not rulers of men, but rulers of themselves. That is the line that divides the powerful from the obedient. The weak need validation to exist. The strong build their own. And once you no longer need the approval of the herd, you become untouchable. Because a man who doesn't crave belonging cannot be controlled. That is the freedom Machiavelli never described. Not the freedom of the body, but the liberation of thought. The first act of freedom is not rebellion, it's awareness, because rebellion still depends on what it resists. But awareness, pure, silent observation, breaks the circle entirely. Machiavelli never spoke of liberation in spiritual terms. He spoke of clarity. He believed the powerful are not gods, but men who see what others refuse to. And that sight alone changes everything. You cannot be enslaved by a system you understand completely. Because once you see its shape, its incentives, its illusions, its psychology, it loses its magic. It becomes machinery. And machinery, once visible, cannot rule the mind. The masses live inside the dream of obedience because they confuse control with order. They believe that life without a master is chaos, but chaos is not disorder. It's truth without management. It's the natural rhythm before someone decided to measure it. The liberated mind learns to stand in that chaos without fear, to watch the game being played, to see the hands behind the curtain and yet to remain calm, because understanding replaces reaction. That's what awareness is, the end of the illusion that you must either serve or rule. When you see the pattern, you stop being a piece on the board. You become the observer of the board itself. Most people spend their lives defending their cage. They call it career, morality, responsibility, faith. but it's just the mind protecting its comfort. Because the unknown and the empty space outside obedience but so feels like death, and in a sense it is. The death of false identity, the death of illusion, the death of the voice inside you that says, I must be approved to exist. But after that, death comes something the obedient never taste: stillness. Not the numbness of comfort, but the quiet of truth. In that quiet, you begin to see the game clearly. You see how every command you ever obeyed was designed not to protect you, but to shape you into something useful. You see how fear disguised itself as virtue, and how morality was carved to fit the needs of those who rule. And suddenly, obedience loses its glamour. You no longer crave permission. You no longer wait for applause. You no longer need to be right, only real. That's the essence of liberation. Not to fight the system, but to walk through it untouched. You still work. You still speak. You still play the roles society demands, but you do it consciously. You play without believing. You obey without surrender. You engage the illusion while never mistaking it for truth. Machiavelli would call that the highest form of mastery. To live within the structure, yet remain above its logic. To wear the mask, but never let it grow into your face. To walk through power without becoming its instrument. Awareness turns obedience into strategy. It allows you to move like the powerful, not because you dominate others, but because you refuse to be dominated by belief. You stop being a follower or a rebel. You become something rarer, a witness. And in witnessing, you gain the one thing the rulers fear most: clarity. Because clarity cannot be controlled. It cannot be bribed, manipulated, or distracted. It doesn't seek comfort. It sees through comfort. When you reach that state, you realize that the true prison was never external. It was built inside, brick by brick, emotion by emotion, fear by fear. And the door to that prison was never locked. You were just too afraid to open it. The world remains the same. Its politics, its hierarchies, its machinery of obedience. But your perception changes everything. You no longer see rulers and servants. You see patterns of human nature, rhythms of need and manipulation, and the silent space between them, where power truly hides. That space is your new home. That silence, your new strength. Because the moment you can observe the storm without being moved by it, you become the calm center around which all things spin. That's real dominance. Not control over others, but serenity within chaos. The freedom to act without being owned by reaction. The obedient live reacting to fear. The powerful live responding to awareness. That's the only difference. So you learn to move slowly, to speak less, to act with precision. Because the one who doesn't rush rules the rhythm. And that's how liberation transforms into mastery. Not through conquest, through comprehension. The few who reach this state no longer seek freedom as escape. They embody it as understanding. They become mirrors to the world, reflecting illusion back at itself until it shatters. And in that reflection, the machinery of obedience begins to lose its grip. Because the system cannot function on awareness, it requires participation. And you, in your stillness, refuse to participate unconsciously. You have stepped out of the play. You no longer kneel, you no longer rise, you simply see. And that is the beginning of power, not over others, but over the mind itself. You've seen what obedience really is. Not a chain, but a choice. Not a cage, but a comfort. And now, you understand why the world will always serve. Because servitude feels safe. Most will turn away now. They'll go back to their rhythm, their noise, their certainty. They'll scroll, consume, obey. Because the illusion of control feels warmer than the cold air of truth. But you stayed. And that means something rare. That somewhere inside you, obedience has started to rot. Maybe you've begun to see the pattern, how power hides in kindness, how control wears the face of morality, how the strongest cage is the one that looks like peace. Don't rush to escape it. Observe it. Watch how it moves. Because the one who observes no longer obeys. The world doesn't fear rebellion. It fears awareness. Because awareness cannot be ruled, cannot be bribed, cannot be bought. So stay in this silence, where obedience dissolves and perception begins. Subscribe you is not for content but for consciousness, because what we build here isn't a channel, it's an unseen academy for the awake. Every week we go deeper into control, psychology, and the architecture of belief. And with each truth uncovered, you'll start to see how freedom doesn't come from fighting the system, but from no longer belonging to it. So if you're ready to stop serving, not the ruler, not the system, not the illusion, then stay, watch, and awaken.